Hello, everybody. Today, it's a great pleasure to open a new season of the FSR Insights 2021-2022. What is new from this new season is that, different from the last year, my colleague, Professor Leonardo Meus, has been generous in sharing the role of host, and we will be together co-hosting the FSR Insights. My name is Lucila, and I'm assistant professor at FSR. And the second news is that we have managed to put together a great opening for you. So we host the three legends of the electricity market field. Professor Joskow, Professor of Economics and Management at MIT. Michael Pollitt, Professor of the Business and Economics of the Jesuit Business School, University of Cambridge. And our Jean-Michel Glachant, Professor and Director of Florence School of Regulation. So welcome and thank you so much for accepting this invitation. The FSR Insights of today has a proposal of launching the recently published Handbook of the Electricity Markets, which the editors are here today to discuss the 22 chapters written by 37 leading international experts, covering the experience of the electricity markets in US, China, Australia, Africa continent, and with many references also to Latin America countries in some of the chapters, which give a book a truly global approach to electricity markets. So last week, the authors have kindly introduced the chapters of the book in 4 videos, which are and will remain on the website. But today we are here to discuss the book with the editors, and we divide the discussion in 2 parts. So the first part, we will have 2 colleagues of the FSR experts on the electricity market who had access to the manuscript in advance, which will be soon available in November. And then we will open the round of questions. So welcome, Valerie. Valerie Hath, or EU expert, to have complementary views of the book together with Shweta, which is our head of the global area, which together will give her position more in the global aspect of the electricity market. So the second part then will be then dedicated to our online audience, and then I will pass the words to Leonardo, who will select the questions from the chat and address the speakers. So for you who are in the audience right now, don't hesitate to address your questions in the chat box. I read it, and Leonardo will read it, keep an eye on them. So let's start it. And without delays, I will pass the floor to Valerie. So Valerie, what you would have your questions? What could be your questions?
Thank you, Lucila. And let me say thank you for the invitation and also the opportunity to ask some questions. So of course I read your chapters and I have many questions, but then I was told that, I cannot use the entire hour because there might also be other people who want to ask questions. So I will reduce myself to a couple of them. And also, maybe let me say that, of course, my questions are inspired by a particular chapter of one of you, but it would actually be great to hear the views of all of you. So my first question was inspired by the chapter by Paul Joskow and Thomas-Olivier Léautier, and it's on capacity mechanisms and their alternatives. And you write in the chapter that one takeaway is that setting up a capacity mechanism is really a legitimate political choice and not an economic imperative. And you also highlight that there is a sort of difference in opinion, where on the one hand, you have policymakers and system operators that want to limit price increases and the rationing of customers. And on the other hand, you have economists who argue that it is necessary, that this is necessary to cover the fixed cost of generation. So the reality is that policymakers in the US, with notable exceptions, and also in most countries in Europe, have decided to go down this road of capacity mechanisms. And I was wondering if you could, first of all, elaborate a bit on this statement that capacity mechanisms are not an economic imperative. And then I was also wondering if you see a need, and if yes, which ways you see to reverse this sort of global trend towards capacity mechanisms.
Who should go first? Oh, I guess I should. Well, I think to say that it's not an economic imperative depends on the underlying economics. I mean, I think the evolution of these mechanisms in the US can really be traced down to the old regime, the pre-liberalization regime, when there were installed capacity targets and reliability assessments based on analysis around those. And you can actually trace these mechanisms back to that period of time. I mean, you have to remember, in the US, New England was a power pool, New York was a power pool, PJM was a power pool, California was a power pool, and they had capacity mechanisms. So the rationale here, and maybe we shouldn't call them capacity mechanisms, but let me just call them supplemental capacity compensation mechanisms. And in the US, they began to arise because we had price caps and still do have price caps in the energy markets, especially when the system is tight. The system operators take out of market actions to balance supply and demand, which don't affect prices generally in most cases. And we still have reliability standards that go back to the old regime, whether it's some articulation of 1 day in 10 years or something fancier than that. All of the system operators in the US, whether they're ISOs or vertically integrated utilities, still every year have to file, or twice a year actually, with the North American Electric Reliability Council reliability assessments, which are based on capacity and reserve assessments of one type or another. So I think aside from Texas, all the ISOs have developed capacity remuneration mechanisms to supplement the energy market, because it was determined that the energy market alone was not producing adequate revenues to support entry efficiently into the market. Texas, which is described often inaccurately, but it described quite well in the chapter in the handbook. Texas has a capacity remuneration mechanism. It's just not a installed capacity market or a capacity payment. It's basically a payment that goes into effect as the market gets tight. And it's administratively determined. It's not market determined. It's based actually on many of the same analyses that one would do in New England or New York to determine what the installed capacity requirement could be. And I don't think these capacity remuneration mechanisms are going away anywhere in the US at all.
Thank you, Joskow. Jean-Michel?
I cannot add much to what Paul said, except that, of course, we have to translate that into European terms. But if we forget reliability standards, maybe many auditors are not familiar, reserves, everybody is familiar with reserves. And the difficulty in Europe is, should we have European standard for reserves? Can we have European standard for reserves? Fabien Roch is advocating that we can in our handbook in the chapter. But if we were able to discuss with Carlos Batlier, a European teaching at MIT, he will say, come on, Jean-Michel, I've never seen a capacity market being reasonable, being rational. And capacity markets are always twisted by one or the other group of interests. Myself, I am neutral. I do not say if I follow Carlos or if I follow Fabien, but I would be surprised that in a market dominated by renewable, we have the reserves that we need. Because to have the reserves that we need, we have to to have the right prices of scarcity, and we have the right guarantee of revenues for people investing into assets of generation, guaranteeing reserves. So I think that question is still widely open and very open regarding the conclusions. But Michael can say the opposite for UK.
Well, thanks, everyone. We've got a chapter in the book about the UK, and I think the UK experience by David Newbury, and I think the UK experience of capacity markets is interesting because, we introduced a capacity market and the prices have fluctuated, but, generally been falling. And of course, that's great. I mean, we want low prices to provide the service that we're interested in. But the question of whether they're really necessary or not still remains. And we've got another chapter in the book by Paul Simshauser on Australia, where they don't have a capacity market in the NEM. Famously, they've had very high prices and they've occasionally had, a blackout. So, are capacity markets really necessary? That's something I take up in the longer run, because I think, in future, we might say in a highly intermittent renewables electricity system, we have the capacity that we have, and we just need to allocate it fairly. And one way of allocating it fairly is with a price. The other is with some sort of rationing algorithm. And that's something I discussed in my chapter in the book. So, we could come at the capacity problem the other way round, rather than with a capacity market.
I think you have to take a step back, because this all starts with the reliability criteria for the bulk power system. And you have to determine what should those reliability criteria be? How often should there be a unplanned outage of demand? How long should it be? How deep should it be? All these questions underlie the design of these capacity remuneration mechanisms. And I've said for many, many years, more than I want to count, that we really need to reevaluate those reliability criteria. They come to us from pre-liberalization times, and maybe they're too tight, maybe they're not too tight, but we really have to take a careful look at them, because when we look across the entire system, 90% of the outages that I have occur down the street from me on the distribution system, and not in the bulk power system. And then the second point I'd make here is looking forward, and Michael's the second section of the book deals with this, is the whole issue of reliability planning, capacity planning is going to have to change in a regime dominated by wind and solar and storage, intermittent generation and storage. The underlying statistical properties of those systems are quite different from an electric power system and relying on dispatchable generation. So, for example, I read yesterday that the wind had stopped in the North Sea. I couldn't believe that was completely true, but I guess they meant the wind was lower than they expected. But that affects all the generators in the North Sea. It's not like you have independent forced outage rates, and that's something that you have to build into your analysis of reliability. And we find in work that we're doing at MIT that as you tighten reliability requirements, and especially as you go down towards zero emissions with more and more intermittent generation, you end up carrying a lot of generation that doesn't run very often, because it's sitting there to deal with the situations in which the wind doesn't blow. I'm using that as and I think, at least in the US, the capacity evaluation program has gotten much more sophisticated, taking these considerations into account, certainly in California and in PJM, and in the UK. I mean, if you're showing up as a solar generator in the UK, I don't think you're getting any capacity credit, because the sun doesn't shine at night, and the UK in the peaks in the winter at 6 p.m. It's dark. So I think we're making progress, but it's going to have to be different when we take account of the special attributes of wind and solar, and they'll be different in different parts of the world.
Fantastic. I think there is, we can return to one of the videos. I think, Paul, you were the one who said it, who mentioned in the video very strong that context matters, even if it sometimes sounds obvious, but it's important to always emphasize when you are looking at the electricity market design. So, Valerie, would you like to address another question to your?
Yes, thank you, Lucila, because Michael Pollitt already mentioned his chapter. And in fact, my second question is inspired by, of course, Michael, your chapter on the future design of electricity markets. So you sort of discussed two contrasting visions, one with a higher granularity of spot prices at the nodal or even at the device level, and the other one where system operators make more use of longer-term flexible control contracts. And I think in your conclusions, you sort of suspect that a truly nodal or fully distributed pricing system is actually not sustainable in a smart world that we are sort of entering. And you state that it is more likely that on the one side, capacity should be expanded to reduce differences in nodal prices, and also that any rationing that does occur should be on a non-price basis for households, but also for small non-residential users. So I have two questions related to that, a bit more detailed. The first is that such a system in which every device is prioritized and supplied on the basis of a priority that was also defined by the user herself seems hugely complex to me in terms of the computational complexity, but also in terms of the costs for metering and measuring devices, and also sort of the education that is necessary for the consumers. So my first question would be, do you think that such a hybrid market design that you discuss could indeed become a reality? And if yes, which would be a candidate country for that? And then the second question I have is that I think you also suggest that falling prices of batteries may facilitate a system in which every household device, let's say a TV or a lighting system or a washing machine, is equipped with a battery. So I was wondering, you know, what are your thoughts regarding also resource efficiency and raw materials, and what would we actually do even if that system were to work with the probably quadrillions of batteries that we would have? What would do it with them at the end of their life? Thank you.
Okay, I mean, this is a sort of big question, isn't it? I think the thing that's clear from the book is that, you know, that we've got a lot of experience of the way markets have been developing, and there's definitely a lot of there's been a lot of developments in the use of more prices, you know, in terms certainly for ancillary services markets and an introduction of wholesale markets. We've seen movements towards, you know, more granular prices, both in time in places like the Australian market, but also across space with LMPs in the US. And I frequently hear, electricity engineer economists talking about pricing to devices and granularity. But I think it's important to say that, as with our capacity market discussion, politicians and regulators have preferences about pricing, you know, and citizens have preferences. And I'm not sure how these things are going to play out. But I am sure that, you know, massive granularity in pricing will never be allowed by a regulator for residential households. It just won't happen. But I think one of the ideas I'd sort of put across, which, you know, you might get a sense of in reading the book, is the center of gravity in electricity is not necessarily with the US and Europe. It's with China. And I think if China can actually develop, you know, a highly automated control-based electricity system where, you know, they do make use of, you know, distributed technologies and not prices, I think you could see the sort of other world that I has emerged, you know, I suggest could emerging. And I suspect what we'll see is hybrids. You see more use of prices and more use of control. And it sort of depends how cheap control technologies get, how cheap batteries get. And it depends what the underlying nature of the problem of intermittency is. I think one of the points we haven't mentioned, which is really important, is we talk about what a very high penetration intermittent renewables electricity system looks like, but most electricity systems in the world aren't there yet. You know, but if we really did get towards a net zero electricity system, then, you know, everything's on the table for control and pricing. It's going to be really difficult to manage that system, and innovation in how we do it will be required.
I see differently from Michael. I agree that regulators and let's say political economy equilibrium is not in favor of big changes, but we do not need 100% consumers shifting. In the chapter of Paul and Thomas-Olivier Leautier, they say that only if 10% of demand was flexible, it's an incredible amount of flexibility offered to the system. And I guess 10% we can get because even if we have only 10% of people interested into making money by being flexible or interested into serving the system serving, which is helping energy transition, it's enough. And this will come. It won't come in my generation. Sorry, I'm too old. It will come in the new generation. Each time in England, we have had inquiries, testing about how educated people are considering advanced, sophisticated type of demand response. They answer very high. 2/3 or more than 2/3 are willing to test, to experiment, etc. It's what we need, and it will come slowly. This I agree, because Internet of Things, IoT, artificial intelligence, AI, is also coming slowly. But in the US, we got 2 experiments. One in the suburb of Los Angeles with 30,000 people, which is roughly 10,000 consumers for 3 years. It is called transactive energy. And the other one is starting in Colorado with 57,000 people, so roughly 20,000 consumers. Each of their key device, which is heating and cooling, electric vehicle, storage, and if they have PV set, each of them has its own sensor to send and receive messages, its own actuator to stop, to go up, to go down, and each home has a kind of small controller having its own algorithm to see if the consumer is keeping the comfort he or she was looking for, and if it goes with the pricing used in the off-grid community or on the transmission grid. So I think it will come. When? Do not know. How much? Do not know, but it will come. That's my point of view.
I'm glad you're very optimistic. I think you're right. It's got to come. But I testified in my first regulatory proceeding in 1971 when I was a graduate student at Yale, and the hearing was about whether they should put into effect peak load pricing. Not fancy peak load pricing, a higher price during the day than at night, higher in the summer than the fall and the spring. And there was just dramatic opposition to it in the US. Anytime you try to change retail prices significantly, the commissions are bombarded with a set of objections, because you end up redistributing in one way or another the allocation of costs among customer groups. But I think we have to remember that the perfect can be the enemy of the good in this regard. We've got to engage the retail side much more for a number of reasons. In particular, the distribution of wholesale prices is going to change rather dramatically over the next 20 years as we deeply decarbonize these systems. And we have a lot of zero prices or close to zero prices and some really high prices. So we'd like consumer behavior to react, but it doesn't have to react to real-time prices. What's very popular in the US are load control schemes, where the local load serving entity basically gives you a discount off your standard rate in return for cycling your air conditioner 15 times during the summer for an hour at a time. There are time of use rates designed to incent owners of EVs to charge at night or during the day, but not between 5 and 8 when prices are really high and the sun is going down. There are water heater control rates. So there are lots of things that can be done to better engage the residential and broadly retail customers in the system. And I think it's going to be more important, but it's one of these things where we have to be practical about it. The economists involved with ERCOT were so excited when a company came into the market, Griddy, to offer residential customers real-time prices. Well, Griddy disappeared in 4 days in February of 2021 because customers' bills were going from $200 to $5,500. And we have to take that kind of political reaction into account in applying practical solutions that get us maybe not all the way there, but some of the way there.
This can be embedded into the algorithm used to manage the actual consumption. And in Europe, we have several startups for EVs. Even it's an anecdote, but the Secretary General of the European Association of TSOs is working in a startup for EVs management. So there is something moving.
Yeah, and it's important to say, isn't it, that with the electrification of heating and of transport, as we discussed, those may be the things that are where you would have more pricing. Whereas what could happen is you have a baseline contract, which is for a certain amount of electricity for your base power needs. So what I think, Paul, you're getting at, I can see us having two different contracts, one for your EV charging and one for your, one for your household use. And there, people are already used to thinking about paying for transport fuel very differently to electricity. They see the price fluctuating all the time at the moment. So I think the idea of more granular pricing for EV charging is, that's an easy sell.
Yeah, I think that's an easy sell, and it's pretty easy to do it if you're willing to invest in the equipment. I mean, it is ironic. I think I have two different meters for my water. One's for watering the lawn and the bushes, and the other's for using water in the house. And if the water company can do that and give me different rate designs for each of them, the electric company should be able to do that.
We will see.
Good point. So I received an update from Sweta, and ironically, she is in the major of power outage due to crazy rains in India and floods. So she won't be able to join us, unfortunately. And now you are actually activating our backup plan. And our backup plan would be to give Valerie the opportunity to ask the third question to you before we jump to the online audience chat. So Valerie, could you address your third question?
Yes, thank you, Lucila. So to be fair to the editors, I also have a question that was inspired by Jean-Michel's chapter on business models. And you already sort of touched a bit on innovation that is coming and maybe necessary business models. So also in your chapter, you say that the future of electricity supply is not just a function of technology or the market design, but that actually also business models for the companies that operate in the sector are very important. And you discussed several business models for the competitive part of the sector, but since we are a school of regulation, about your idea, a broader question this time, on the future business models for the regulated grids. And also follow-up question, what those future business models mean for the role, the priorities, but also for the resources and the skills that are required of regulators in the future.
Oh my God. To simplify roughly, the grids, they first started to implement what wholesale markets were saying regarding the future prices. But they did it running their own market, their own balancing market real time. So they were combining the two, the day-ahead and the balancing real time. After that, they started to think differently, which is how to best allocate our copper or grid capacity, how to best allocate. We need sensors, we need more information, blah, 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 blah. And then we can better allocate the capacity. We need market coupling. And then they entered into, for me, a very big step. Yeah, okay, but this is only with existing old traditional wholesale markets and existing old traditional utilities. But now we have DER, we have decentralized energy resources, we have electric vehicles, we have storage, we have demand response, we may have smart buildings, which is net zero building, and we have to equip for each of these new things, because each of these new things had to be hosted at the distribution level and at the transmission level. And then they are entering a new other revolution, which is, oh gosh, if we do not incentivize users of the grid themselves to adapt their behavior to the state of the system, either the transmission system, the centralized one, or the distribution system, the decentralized, we are making a mistake. Then their business model is made of very different parts, if you can understand. Huh? The part where they have to adapt to distributed energy resources, electric vehicles, etc., they can do within existing incentive regulation, because Paul knows that since decades. It is when you can measure the output of the grid, but you can have performance-based regulation. It's easy to do. It has to be done, but it's easy to do. Regarding the incentives to give to the users, it's another part of incentive regulation. And on this, I think Michael has many ideas. I stop there.
Would like to go next? Michael, Paul?
I'll let Paul have the last word, maybe. I think I like Jean-Michel's point that he makes in his chapter about the grid companies needing to change the way they do business. I mean, I think one of the worries, especially in mature electricity markets, is that with electrification of heating and electrification of transport, and with more distributed generation going on, that could be a license for grid companies to just massively expand their networks, regardless of managing the system. And certainly in the UK, we've been very concerned about, optimizing the use of existing assets, because actually most of the low voltage network is underutilized most of the time. There's a huge amount of redundant capacity there. Yeah, there may be a peak capacity problem, but it's basically underused assets most of the time. So creating these local constraint management markets, or and trying to get more flexibility out of the existing connectees, that is something which is really important. And I think to your second part of your question about, well, what does this mean for regulation? Well, we need the book is a Handbook of Electricity Markets. I'm sure there's another book on a Handbook of Electricity Regulation. I think the bottom line for all economic regulators of electricity systems is they have to focus on the big picture. What does all this mean for the final consumer in terms of their bill? And also worry about the distribution of who's paying what. I talk to, when I talk to regulators, they're obsessed by innovation, and they don't want to stop innovation in the electricity system. But actually, what we pay regulators for is to make sure people aren't being ripped off, and that's what they need to stick, they need to continue to have that as their priority, because otherwise, they could be just unleashing lots of investment and lots of innovative expenditure, which actually isn't delivering for final customers. So there's a lot of good cost-benefit analysis required by regulators, not to believe everything they're told, but to facilitate things that do deliver.
The system is organized quite differently in the US and portions of Canada. In the areas where we have ISOs or RTOs, we don't have grid companies in the sense you have them in the UK, one company per country. The ISOs don't own anything. They operate the short-term markets, they operate the transmission system, and they have a planning process that they go through to plan for the need for new transmission investments. And then they have to designate which transmission owner is going to actually build the facilities that they've identified. And this is a complex system. What are the incentives of the ISO? What do you include in planning? At first, they were only allowed to include reliability. Then they were allowed to include market efficiency, that is reducing congestion. Now they're being asked to look at interregional transmission expansions. Next, they're going to be asked to look specifically at transmission expansions to facilitate integration of wind and solar into the system. And I think the question of what kinds of incentives you give to the system operator and how you integrate the incumbent owners of transmission capacity, which is many, many companies, even in New England, with the new merchant generators, the new merchant transmission operators that are coming along and have basically adopted the U.S. natural gas pipeline model. I think it requires a whole new rethink for us as to how we organize the system. I mean, in the paper I just published in the Economics of Energy and Environmental Policy, I talk about the differences between the U.S. and the UK and excuse me, the US and the EU, and I include the UK as well. And I just think we're missing the ball here, especially if we want to support decarbonization quickly, as at least the current administration wants to do. And there are things we can do, but it will break some eggs. And that's always the challenge when you have so many states and so many regulators and interest groups.
It's important to say, isn't it, in the book, we also discuss developing countries, and there I think the issues are really quite different. You know, the issue there, which one of the chapters explores, is, you know, how do you use a combination of grid extension, microgrids, and you know, self-supply to actually get more people on the grid and to make grids more reliable. So, you know, there's a real contrast, isn't there, between mature grids and what's happening in grids that continue to be underdeveloped, of which there are many around the world.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your answers. And perhaps I think it's time now to move to the second part of the webinar, which I will hand to Leonardo, who has received already like tons of questions. So thank you so much for the audience. We'll continue addressing questions, and Leonardo has selected a few of them. Leo, it's with you now.
Thank you, Lucila. And also on my behalf, congrats, really great book. I have some of my own questions, but the audience is very active, so I'll give them priority. Some of them already submitted questions after watching your videos, which were great, by the way. For those that didn't see them yet, you can find them on the website. And there are some other questions that we received live here. So the first one we got actually already just when the videos were released was I think to be addressed to all three of you, is like, what should be the top priorities for EU regulators when they address or change market design, electricity market design in the ongoing transition?
We start with a joke, Leo. I do not know any EU regulator. I know only European countries regulator, and then the other colleague can answer.
And before I'll let you react, let me also add to some of the comments that were made live, because we have, for instance, Peter Crampton with us, who already made a statement on what he thinks the EU regulators could consider. And one is to move to nodal, because he quotes, he reminds us of the 1.5 billion of redispatching costs we currently have in Germany. And he makes a second suggestion, namely that the current approach we have with self-dispatching, right? So we don't have a kind of central optimization. And he claims that that is in the benefit of the largest utilities that have an advantage to self-optimize their resources. So he questions whether that is something we should keep.
Leo, this is a rational approach. But we do not have any nodal regulator. They are national regulator. No one is, well, no one, I exaggerate, but few are taking care of zonal approach. How many zones do we need? What are the best zonal design of any national market? Very few are taking care. So nodal in EU, maybe, but after my retirement, and I'm not retiring this year, not next year, not the following one. But
I don't think it's just nodal. I mean, there's another difference between North America and the EU. In North America, all of the ISOs have basically adopted the same energy market design. I mean, there are some differences. It's basically the same. The day-ahead market is integrated with the real-time market and the ancillary service markets. There's a security constrained bid-based dispatch that simultaneously optimizes the bid-based generation supplies with transmission constraints. You get LMPs. Quite frankly, the LMPs in New England don't vary very much very often, but you get them. But it's really the integration of the markets that I think is fundamentally different between the two regions. And I'm kind of surprised that aside from numbers about redispatch costs, that we haven't done more comparisons between the US and Europe to see how these different market designs actually work, and then think through which market designs are going to work best as we move to deeply decarbonize these systems. And Jean-Michel, I appreciate the problems of different countries doing their own things, but it takes leadership. I mean, look at New England has a LMP market. Texas has an LMP market. I can think of no two regions in the US that are more politically distanced from one another than those two regions, but they came convinced that that was a good market design for the energy market. Now, they differed on how you do capacity remuneration mechanisms and price caps and all of that, but the basic market design is the same.
Personally, I think that locational markets will come first, that flexibility needs will push distribution system operators to call for local arrangement, local prices, and local response to constraints. And on this, one day we can have big changes. But it has to start with something which can be understood and implemented, experimented. So we have locational pricing in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal, but this locational pricing is not spreading in other countries because it is not seen as bringing something very useful. Yeah. But I can be wrong. Huh?
Yeah. My understanding is Italy has they do redispatch and they have pricing zones after the fact, but they haven't fully integrated the day ahead and real-time markets.
No, nobody does.
Nobody does in Europe.
Okay, the question was about, what's the priority? The number one priority, which is something that one of the chapters in the book by Karen Palmer discusses, is we've got to get the high level incentives right. It's all very well having a discussion about market design, where I think there is, there's lots of potential disagreement, which about what constitutes a good market design. But I think we all need to recognize it's high level in decarbonization incentives that will deliver a low carbon electricity system. It's not the market design, So you need to get carbon pricing right. You need to get your subsidy regime for renewables right. You need to get your, and if you don't get those things right, we're not going to decarbonize the electricity system. Then after that, the market design, of course, is important. We're economists. We think market design is important. It's important to say that electricity system optimization is much more complicated than locational marginal pricing. That's only one price among many potential prices. And as a good economist should know, just getting one of set of prices in a general equilibrium system right doesn't guarantee you're going to be efficient overall. In the US system, I agree with Paul, it'd be nice to have a good comparison because, in general, we're quite good in Europe, but getting our networks invested in, expanding capacity, adding lots of renewables, these are other, objectives of market designs. And, a lot of the analysis that's been done on nodal pricing in Europe just shows there's not that much advantage from switching the system. And also, don't you think system operators are already aware of what the shadow nodal prices are and already making decisions against them? So So let's not exaggerate what some of the benefits might be of switching to nodal price, because if they were really that large, we would have done it. And I don't believe they really are.
I agree that there are other more important issues. And in the paper I just wrote, I concluded the Europeans actually are far ahead of the EU, and the UK are far ahead of the US in terms of transmission planning focused on both market coupling, but more importantly on accessing the best wind and solar generating sites. So I think there's something to learn from both, and we have to set our priorities correctly to move down that path. I think that one of the challenges we have in the US is we don't have carbon prices. And we have some regional prices, but they're trivial prices. And this is really a problem. It's not that carbon prices solve everything, because who knows exactly what the right carbon price is and whether it's consistent with the decarbonization goals. But when you look at the alternative, if you look at the House of Representatives bill that's floated this week, it's an amazing menu of subsidies and penalties and that seem to not be related to almost anything. And I think the power of having significant carbon prices, and I don't mean $40, I mean $200, and a stable, credible trajectory of those prices over time, I think provides a lot of incentives for meeting the decarbonization commitments that have been made.
Leo, perhaps you can.
Yeah, happy. There is many more questions,
Yes.
so let me follow up with. There are a few more specific. So there is one specifically for Paul. In Europe, we talk a lot about cooperatives, energy communities, and also aggregators as one of these new type of players we saw coming into the market. Can you tell us a bit more about how that is in the US? Is that also happening?
Well, I put up a slide, as I recall in the video. Competitive retail supply has not been a big seller in the US. There are about a dozen states, that maybe even less than a dozen, that have it fully operable. It's been, I think, much more important for larger customers, for industrial customers, in terms of getting more innovative products. There's been less that's happening with residential customers. I think in the long run, it's kind of a problem, because in the states that don't have retail competition of any kind, resource adequacy and reliability ends up being the burden of the distribution company. It's not clear that's where that should lie. And any changes in rate design and new product offerings become something the regulator has to decide on, not a retail supplier. And they don't provide, if they're not there, they're not providing the pressures to try new things. So I think that really has to evolve here in the US. In terms of aggregators, I think they're going to play a large role, but aggregators can work with traditional distribution companies as well as others. But I think aggregators have a particularly important role in aggregating distributed generation and storage so that it interacts efficiently with the broader wholesale market. And I think that's going to become very important if we're going to provide incentives for large amounts of distributed generation, primarily PV, rooftop PV in the US, and storage. And I see aggregators playing an important role in putting these all together and interacting with the wholesale market.
Thank you. We also received a question specifically for Michael, but I think Jean-Michel touched upon it already when he was talking about local markets and that he believes that there will be tendering locally. But this question was for you, Michael, because it's somebody that looked at your video and got the impression that you also think that maybe, in distribution grids, there is a need for longer term contracting for certain services. Could you maybe elaborate on that?
Okay. So what short run markets are great when there's lots of uncertainty. about what it is you know, how much you want. I think, you know, and also perhaps when there's the possibility that you can develop a price history that people can invest against. I think one of the problems of local markets is they are very small. And the question is whether you really want to procure small quantities of something via a market when that might be quite costly, because the underlying investors that are going to be supplying you with, you know, local constraint management, you know, they might want 10%, whereas the grid company now, we're financing grid assets at sort of maybe 2% in the UK real. So hang on, if I knew that the battery was an answer to a local constraint, and that's the long run answer which solves this constraint for the next 20 years, why wouldn't the grid company make that investment as a long, you know, it doesn't have to be their battery, but as a long-term contract. Whereas, you know, it would be crazy to be procuring this in some sort of day ahead market at a particular location. So, you know, when we've looked at these local markets, you know, they have got very high transaction costs. They're very low volumes. They're it's not clear, you know, these constraints can easily disappear, you know, if the line gets upgraded. So, you know, I think the benchmark regulated investment has to be clearly specified. And, you know, one could imagine, and I've been talking to, you know, distribution companies about this, instead of saying the benchmark investment is upgrading the line, the benchmark investment could be having a mobile battery, which you just move around your network and solve the constraint with that. So which you own or which you've got a long-term contract for. So, you know, economists aren't wedded to a particular length of contract as being optimal. You know, whatever the optimal length of contract is, that's what we should have. And I think one of the problems about outsourcing, you know, and saying something must be done by a spot market is you've actually locked in the contract type. And one of the advantages of procurement by the distribution company is they can vary the length of contract they sign.
I'd like to make a philosophical statement. I saw wholesale markets coming. I saw retail markets coming. I saw balancing markets coming. Nobody has been able to clearly say what they will do and when. And even Paul, very gently in Toulouse years ago, said, guys, I was fully aware that we need to open markets. I was not aware of the right market design to do it. I remember this. So it is the same regarding the other part of electricity sector or electric markets opening. We do not know. It's not because we do not know that it won't come. It's not because we do not know that it won't come in this decade, even at the end of the decade. But we do not know that that's it. It's very important to keep in mind. Huh? All of this, wholesale market, retail market, balancing markets. Balancing markets. The CEO of the French transmission company found to the engineer school where I was working with a PhD student to get the PhD student sacked. He has not been sacked because chance, Frank Woolak and others invited us in the American Economic Association meeting in January. We're being rescued by the US. If not this, the young engineer would have been sacked by the engineering school because the CEO cannot be resisted. It was in 2003, 2004. That's life. Huh?
Yeah, I think my one response to that is we moved away from local markets. You know, one of the great insights of, you know, Paul and his colleagues was, you know, you could have a market that was big enough at wholesale, you know, generation level. You need to convince me that we can go back to having a really local market. You know, that, you know, sorry. You know, so one of the things we've been working on is, can you somehow link all these local markets to make them one big market? if you can do that, and maybe economists can do that, then, you can solve the back to a local market problem.
I think we have to be humble, though, about market design. And I don't want to pick on the UK, but I will, in a positive sense. I mean, if you go back to 1990, the UK's had at least three market designs. There was the pool, and there were adjustments to the pool, and there were efforts to deconcentrate it, and so on. Then there was NITA and BETA, which I thought was kind of wacky, but there was a constituency for it. Now you have a much more controlled market. You have a capacity market. You do competitive bidding for contracts for renewable energy. And my view, quite frankly, is the current market design in the UK is where the system is going, if not by design, by default, at least in the US. And that's because the states, which have adopted decarbonization commitments, are also mandating procurement of wind and solar and hydro, normally from Canada, under long-term contracts. And at the same time, we have industrial customers like Google and Microsoft and Walmart that are out there signing 10 to 20-year PPAs without any much thought about how they either match their own loads or fit into the larger system. So I think we're going to have to kind of manage this hybrid market that Fabian Rolke has talked about. Whether we like it or not, it's emerging for a variety of reasons. And I really think we have to make some effort to ensure that these contracts are properly designed so that they can, in fact, be fully integrated in the short-term markets, because some of them are not. If the price is 5 and the marginal cost is 0, that's going to provide bad incentives when the system's constrained and there have to be curtailments, for example. So that's my sense for going forward. It's going to be a bit messy, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we're approaching the end, but I think Leonardo has in his mind like the last question to close. Perhaps you could give like the final statement. Go, Leo?
Yeah, sure. I read in the chapter by Frank Wallach a really nice list of research topics he suggests the new generation to work on, and there are lots of them. But I'm sure Paul, Jean-Michel, and Michael have a few as well. What would you advise new PhD students to work on electricity markets?
Well, now I work mostly with sort of engineering economics PhD students, and I think there's an interest in revisiting the way we analyze reliability and how we put that into models of system models. I think there's an interest in innovative pricing schemes for sure. And there's a big interest in how we integrate distributed resources, including storage, into the broader system, because at least in the US, the incentive structure for doing that is far from ideal at the present time. There are some experiments going on in New Hampshire and Vermont to try to make these resources dispatchable, but I think that's a long way off. So those are the things I'm interested in, as long as, in addition to the financing issues, how are we going to finance all of these things?
On my side, I'm interested into how to best integrate distributed energy resources, electric vehicles, local punctual storage, demand response, to integrate this into the system. Will it be better done very locally in a community within a building with an asset fleet manager? Will it be done better at what we call now the local level, which is around the distribution grid, being part of the adventure or not? Could we do this also at the centralized level, which is using directly the prices coming from the TSO, the centralized market, like the experiment made for 3 years in California? I would like to know, and I would like everybody to tell me. Another way also to do it is to put it into the hands of the supplier, as Octopus in UK, Octopus is offering a service to manage your PV, your storage, your electrical car simultaneously, and your demand response. What's the best way of managing integration of all these new resources? That's what I am interested in.
Let me say something completely different. I think there's lots of interesting things happening in China with markets. I think there's a real need to sort of understand how the Chinese system is developing and to help China to move towards markets and to sort of give them some of the lessons that we've learned, mistakes to avoid. I still think there's lots of work to be done on extending electrification in poor countries. And I would very much encourage PhD students to be working on those questions. Maybe we've got enough people working on some of these, real cutting edge market design questions, but not enough on some of these really big ticket items for the world.
I think you have inspired here at least the PhD students who are here to write in very, very important topics at the moment. And I think we are getting close to the end of the event. And I would like to thank you so much for your contributions. I can speak for myself as a young scholar, how you inspired my own work and my choices of work, knowing about and understanding the debate between in your own disagreements. It's how it drives all the thinking and evolution of marketing, how the market should be designed and how the market should be regulated as well. So thank you so much. And before ending, I would like just to announce the next upcoming events of Lawrence School of Regulation. So today we have this 15th of September event. The next one will be on 23rd, the Gender Equality and Diversity in the Energy Transition, which is a debate hosted by Glachant and Alberto Potocini. And on 24, we'll have an event on gas, is the EU ready for the new methane legislation. And besides this event on the book, we still have we are going to have more events in which the editors, together with some authors, would be again discussing the topics. The book is going to be out available in November of this year, and we will still have we are going to have a next webinar on 11th of October and another one on 15th of November. So thank you so much. Enjoy, read the book as soon as it's out, because it's definitely a book to be read, a great contribution. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.